So I recommend this for anybody who is studying history, who is studying economics, personal finance, black banking, American banking, home loans, wealth building, any of those things. This falls right in any of those categories.
Reading is fundamental.
Hello everybody, this is DeWitt Scott, and I'm here breaking down some dope book reviews, giving you my thoughts on many of the books that I've read. As a deep bibliophile, book lover, reader, I read a lot of different books, and I'm here to just break down these reviews for you to help you get a brief understanding of the book, so that if you are interested in the book, maybe you can know what it is to look for, or maybe you need some information on a particular book that you have not read, but maybe I've read it. So I'm here giving you these breakdowns, these details for all of these books that I've read before. This video here is a review for a book titled The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. All right. This book was a book that I truly enjoyed, really loved it. It basically talks about the history of black banking in America. So it talks about many of the black-owned banks throughout the 20th century into the 21st century throughout America, and the ways in which they sort of set out to improve the economic structure of America's black community. So when breaking down the history of banking for black Americans, African Americans, the book starts with the Freedmen's Bank, which was the bank that was created directly after slavery in the 1800s. It was created directly after slavery, specifically for black people and black families to deposit their money and to use their money in ways that benefit the entire community. So the breakdown begins there. It talks about the history of that bank. It talks about how that bank ended up closing down, and a lot of black people post-slavery lost their money because of the closing of the Freedmen's Bank. And then it sort of connects into the early 1900s and how a lot of black people across the country felt, okay, we're living in these communities. We need loans. We need some sort of economic institutions that speak to us, and the creation of black banks all across the country. I think that going into black banking from that perspective is really important, because when you give that history, then you realize that the ownership of black banks is something that really isn't new. And once you see the timeline as expressed in this book all the way up into the present, then you see that we're actually moving in a direction where we're declining in the number of black banks that we have in America. So talking about it from that angle, the author does a very good job giving you sort of a picture of that. I think that picking up from there, when you're talking about not just black banking, but banking overall, the book touches on banking overall, right? A lot of the other larger banks, your Chase, your Bank of America, and how the government, the banking system, mortgage lenders, all these other factors came into play in ways that sort of disenfranchised the black community for generations. So for instance, there is sections of the book that talks about how the government came up with ways to insure home loans for Americans, right? And we're talking post-World War II, early 1900s, mid-1900s. The government decided that they wanted to sort of expand the middle class. And one of the best ways to expand the middle class then, and still to this day, is home ownership. So the federal government came up with the idea to back and insure many of the home loans in America. That would encourage people to buy more homes. It would make it easier for them to pay their mortgages and sort of live and build wealth in ways that they could use for generations. Well, when thinking about that, and we're talking again post-World War II, so we're talking 1940s, the overt racism in America against black people is, at a peak, right? So yes, these home loans were back, but they weren't back for black people, right? Black people did not have access to federally guaranteed home loans. So because black people didn't have access to these home loans, black people did not buy houses at the same rate as whites. White people's home ownership grew, expanded, middle class expanded, suburban America expanded, but black people were sort of left behind because they weren't able to take part in these federal government loans. Even in instances where there were things such as restrictive covenants. And a restrictive covenant was an agreement from a homeowner, typically a white homeowner, that says once you are ready to sell this particular house in which you live, you are not allowed to sell it to a black person, right? Literally written into the actual documents, the legally binding documents for white homeowners. That was restrictive covenants. Tie that into what was known as redlining, and redlining essentially is just, I'm breaking it down succinctly, but redlining essentially was a color-coded system in which mortgage institutions, lending institutions would determine who is qualified for loans. And if your particular neighborhood, or all the neighborhoods were sort of color-coded in a range of colors, but if your neighborhood was coded in red, as determined by the mortgage lender, then that neighborhood cannot be lended to for home loans. And guess whose neighborhoods were usually overrepresented by red, right? Black neighborhoods, redlining. So you start to see how all of these things, right? The failure of the black banks, the lack of support for black banks, the lack of federal government support for black people to own homes, the restrictive covenants, the redlining, how all of these sort of issues come together over 100 years, 100 plus years, and leads to this broadening of the racial wealth gap, right? This broadening of the racial wealth gap. There are many people and institutions who are trying to reverse those effects to this day, right? And the book sort of touches on that, but it really just talks about how we got here with this racial wealth gap, particularly from the perspective of the black banks, right? So that's just this is a bit of a breakdown of the book. I think it's a really good book. It was really well written, citations immaculate, right? And it's just a very interesting story, regardless of where you live in America, to just realize or to understand the history of black banking, the history of economic power, economic self-determination for the black community, right? So I recommend this for anybody who is studying history, who is studying economics, personal finance, black banking, American banking, home loans, wealth building, any of those things. This falls right in any of those categories, right? So check this out. It's called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. All right, I recommend it. Really dope book. Hope you enjoy it the way that I did.
Reading is fundamental.